You'll get your freedom in 14 days, Sarah murmured under her breath, the words barely audible over the artificial cheer of the office's open floor plan. She sat in her corner office, boxed in by sterile glass walls and decades of barely contained contempt. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, the glow of her monitor casting sharp shadows across the creases near her mouth, the kind of lines earned through years of late nights, boardroom landmines, swallowing rage like mouthwash. 14 days. That's all she had left. 2 more weeks, and the stock options she'd clung to like a rosary during a slow corporate crucifixion would finally vest. 7 figures, clean, no alimony, no kids, no deadbeat siblings to sponge it away. Just her and a quiet house somewhere the ocean could drown out every email she'd ever ignored with a smile. Sterling Price, Inc., that sleek glass sarcophagus of executive arrogance, been her battlefield for 15 years. She knew its rituals by heart. Monday morning pep talks that reeked of desperation. Passive-aggressive status meetings where middle managers tried to look visionary by regurgitating her slides. And Arthur Sterling, the living embodiment of ego on stilts, presiding over it all like a king whose crown was forged from outdated buzzwords and golden parachutes. Her inbox dinged. 37 unread emails. She didn't look. Instead, she glanced at her browser tab. Hidden behind a pivot table was her real focus, a real estate listing from Cannon Beach, Oregon, clifftop, wind-warped shingles, wraparound porch. The kind of house where you could drink coffee and watch the world fall apart without being asked to make a slide deck about it. Arthur's voice snapped through the corridor, sharp, performative laughter that made her scalp tighten. He was walking with 2 investors, probably giving them the same line he gave everyone about lean innovation cycles and disruption through synergy. He didn't understand either concept, but he had the teeth, the suits, the moneyed charm of a man who'd failed upward his entire life. She sipped the last of her burnt office coffee and turned back to the quarterly report. Every department's numbers stacked like dominoes. Except Athena. Project Athena was supposed to be Arthur's legacy, an AI-driven, cross-platform marketing system that would redefine B2B conversion architecture. In practice, it was a clunky monstrosity spliced together from expired third-party licenses and spaghetti code. Sarah had spent 2 weeks untangling the back-end documentation after the previous director quit mid-sprint. There it was again, a fatal sync bug buried deep in the campaign scheduler. One token failure, and the whole thing would lock out client access for 48 hours. If Athena went live as planned, it would hemorrhage data faster than PR could plug the hole. Sarah stared at the bug. She could fix it in 20 minutes. Patch the code, write up a few lines of mitigation strategy, drop it in Arthur's lap with a ribbon on it. But she didn't let it burn. She saved the report, marked it complete, and filed it with the others. 2 more weeks. That was the deal she'd made with herself. Don't save them. Bleed for people who'd let you die on the conference room floor while they ordered more catered sushi. Footsteps approached, fast, familiar. Arthur appeared at her door, not knocking, just appearing like mildew or IRS audits. Sarah, he said, his smile just wide enough to show capped molars. Athena update. Are we ready to make magic? She didn't blink. Depends on your definition of magic. He laughed like she'd told the best joke he'd heard all week. Always were the realist. That's why you've lasted as long as you have. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. But between us, the board's starting to ask if your heart's still in it. I wasn't aware loyalty had an expiration date, she replied. He gave her that look again, the one that made her think of someone browsing discount meats, calculating shelf life. Well, keep up the good work. 2 weeks from launch, we all gotta be bulletproof. Tapped twice on her glass wall with the back of his knuckles like she was a fish in a tank, then strutted away. Sarah sat perfectly still until he vanished around the corner. Then she turned slowly to face the city. Cleveland's skyline, gray and cold, stretched out under a sky that couldn't decide between drizzle or apathy. Below, brake lights pulsed like warning signs. She felt it again, that low hum like tension in a power line. The one that told her something's coming. Periphery, Slack messages pinged. The Athena team, one read, we're duct taping Athena together here lol. I give it 3 weeks before the client data eats itself, she smirked. No lies detected. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could blow the whistle. She could raise the flag. She could earn another round of applause for saving a sinking ship built by liars. Instead, she typed, noted, let's discuss during tomorrow's sync, and muted the channel. She closed her laptop, stood, the office hummed with fluorescent artificiality. People tapping, smiling too hard, sprinting toward PowerPoint oblivion. But Sarah had already checked out. She had seen the flaw in the hull. And this time, she wasn't going to fix it. She was going to aim it. Sarah's calendar pinged at exactly 9 a.m. with a bland little notification. Performance review Arthur. No warning. No prior discussion. No agenda. Just a meeting title as sterile and ominous as a scalpel. Her stomach dropped. Not because she feared it, she'd danced this dance before, but because of the timing. 2 weeks. Less than that now. 9 business days until her stock vested. She stared at the invite like it might rearrange itself into something benign. A strategy touchpoint, a coffee chat, anything but what her gut told her it was. She took the long way to Arthur's office. Passed by the cafeteria, past the fake plants, past the wall of Employee of the Month portraits. All young, all male, all forgettable. Her heels tapped against the polished concrete like a metronome, counting down her dignity. Arthur's office, a shrine of self-importance, sat at the end of the executive hallway like a glass coffin. No doors. Just transparent walls to remind you that privacy was a myth and hierarchy was holy. He was already inside, seated like a smug spider in a designer web, sipping from a tumbler of something amber and expensive that he pretended wasn't scotch. "Sarah," he said, motioning to the chair across from him like a man inviting you to your own funeral. "Have a seat." She lowered herself slowly, every muscle taut. He smiled, tight, rehearsed, the kind of expression a weatherman makes before announcing a hurricane. "I wanted to talk about Q1 deliverables," he began, pulling up a file on his tablet with the practiced flair of a magician revealing the trapdoor. Specifically, the Athena delay. Sarah blinked. The delay caused by the third-party platform change that we flagged last quarter. Arthur nodded with mock sympathy, like she just told him her dog died. "It's a pattern, Sarah. You're a legacy asset. That used to be an advantage. But lately, you've been," he tilted his head, searching for the right insult dressed as insight. Out of step, hands curled into fists under the table. "I flagged the Athena API mismatch twice in written memos. It was ignored." He leaned back and crossed one leg over the other, revealing a sock embroidered with tiny dollar signs. "You're not being punished. We're just realigning, trimming the fat, making sure the team is agile, responsive, and loyal." "Loyal," she repeated, her voice like cracked glass. "You're questioning my loyalty." Arthur clasped his hands together like he was about to offer prayer. 15 years, Sarah. That's a long run in this business. But we've got a younger team now. They think faster, move sharper. Your role, it's become redundant." A long silence choked the room. Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the final cruelty. Effective immediately, Arthur said almost cheerfully, "Your access has already been revoked. HR is waiting to walk you through the transition." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "My stock vests in, unvested options are forfeited upon termination." He interrupted smoothly, sliding a folder toward her. "It's in the contract. Page 6, Clause B." She stared at the folder like it was soaked in poison. "This isn't personal," he added, but his eyes were gleaming. "It's structural." Sarah stood. Her legs felt like concrete pylons. She didn't grab the folder. She didn't speak. If she did, she'd scream. If she screamed, burn the whole building down with her voice. Outside, she walked the long corridor like a ghost in reverse, fading in, not out. People looked up from their laptops and quickly looked away. HR was already standing outside her office, 2 of them, as if she were a criminal being evicted from her own life. "Miss Jenkins," one of them said gently, holding out a small white box. "You can collect your things now. We've printed your final paperwork. Security will escort you downstairs." She walked into her office, the room that had seen her survive mergers, acquisitions, 4 rebrands, and 1,000 tiny betrayals, and stared at the desk, the coffee mug, the framed photo of a place she'd never made it to, the plants she never watered but somehow stayed alive. Her fingers touched the edge of the desk. Cool, familiar, like touching a gravestone with her own name carved into it. She packed her belongings in silence. Heart was hammering, not in fear, but in rage so pure it turned white-hot behind her ribs. Her vision tunneled. As they walked her to the elevator, no one met her gaze. Cowards, every one of them. People she'd mentored, covered for, protected. Now they were just office furniture with facial expressions. The elevator doors closed. By the time she hit the lobby, her future was ash. 15 years, gone. Her retirement, gone. Her dignity, shot point blank by a man in a tailored suit with a god complex. But underneath the devastation, something else began to stir. It wasn't hope. It was the slow ignition of something far more dangerous. resolve. The first night, Sarah didn't cry. She just sat on the floor of her Cleveland condo, surrounded by the limp remains of her office life, stuffed into a white HR-issued box, sipping from a bottle of Pinot Grigio with a twist cap and no shame. Kind of wine you don't drink, you endure. It burned, slightly going down, and she welcomed the sting. The lamp above her buzzed like it had an opinion. She stared at the folder Arthur had slid across the table, still unopened on the coffee table. Her name printed on it like a death notice, effective immediately, as if for years there were a clerical error. Like the late nights and corporate bloodletting and 3 a.m. crisis calls had been some elaborate misunderstanding. 15 years turned into severance and silence in the time it takes a sociopath to clear his throat. She downed another mouthful. The next morning, she woke up on the couch with the worst kind of headache, the emotional kind, the kind that blooms behind your eyes and whispers, "You let them win." Emails had started coming in already, not from anyone who mattered, no one brave, just the cowards. Light condolences from junior staffers who wanted to cover their asses just in case she resurfaced powerful. A few vapid "so sorry to hear," messages from people who never looked her in the eye during meetings. Not a damn word from Arthur, not from Troy, not from anyone who'd actually sat at the table while she bled for the firm. She threw her phone across the room. It bounced against the wall and landed face down on the rug like even it was ashamed of her. Saturday night, she'd found herself in the kitchen at 1 a.m., barefoot, unraveling, eating cereal from the box, half drunk. The wine had turned metallic on her tongue. Her reflection in the microwave door looked like someone who'd aged 10 years in 2 days. She opened her laptop, logged into her private, encrypted vault, a cloud server she maintained with every strategic document she'd ever touched at Sterling Price. Not to hoard, just for safety, because in corporate America, people forget who really builds the empires. She had files Arthur didn't even know existed. Old pitch decks, infrastructure maps, market analysis, vendor back-channel chatter. Everything, things she used to protect, things she used to care about. Now it all looked like ammunition. She flipped through files for hours, click, swipe, scroll. The Athena flaw stared back at her like a loaded gun. But that wasn't the angle she wanted. Too obvious, too traceable. No, if she did this, it had to be subtle, invisible, precise. At 3:12 a.m., she opened a new browser window, went incognito, then dark web proxy, then Tor. She didn't type Innovate Dynamics right away. She just sat there, index finger hovering over the keys. Innovate had always been the upstart, nimbler, hungrier. A quarter Sterling Price's size, but aggressive as hell. The kind of company Arthur used to scoff at in meetings. Burn out in 5 years, he once said, sipping imported sparkling water like it was truth serum. They don't have our infrastructure. Yeah, well, she was the infrastructure. Sarah opened a secure email client, created a burner address. No name, no trace. Subject, interested in a competitive edge. She paused before typing, flexing her fingers like a pianist before a concert. Then she began. There's a weak link in Sterling Price's supply chain. One of their Tier 2 logistics vendors is operating with outdated routing software that's caused repeat shipping discrepancies. Internal audits have been suppressed to avoid affecting Q2 earnings projections. If someone, say, a market rival, were to acquire that vendor and cut the SLA time in half, Sterling Price would lose 2 key regional contracts within 90 days. She reread the message 3 times. It was enough. Not too much. Not traceable. Just a breadcrumb. Bloodstain that only someone who'd worked deep inside the machine would recognize. She hovered over send for a full minute. And then she clicked. The email disappeared like a secret into the void. She leaned back, eyes wide, chest heaving, not from guilt, but from clarity. Cold, ruthless clarity. They took her future. They mocked her loyalty. They burned 15 years down to ash and expected her to slink away. But now she was a ghost in their machine. She just started rattling the chains. The reply came 3 days later. No name, no signature. Just 5 words in a reply email sent from an equally disposable address. Meet me, Tuesday, 10 a.m. Mug and Bean, Midtown. Sarah stared at it like it might explode. Her pulse quickened. Mug and Bean was barely a coffee shop, half tile, half flickering lights, tucked between a pawn shop and a vape store. Kind of place executives would never be caught dead in. Which made it perfect. Tuesday morning arrived with freezing wind and low clouds, a sky that looked like it wanted to spit on the whole city. Sarah pulled her hoodie low, scarf tight, and slipped into the cafe like a fugitive. She carried nothing except a burner phone she'd bought in cash at a gas station on the edge of town, and a small USB drive tucked inside a tampon wrapper in her coat pocket. Man waiting for her didn't introduce himself. He was late 30s, black, in a charcoal trench coat with eyes that moved like he didn't trust his own shadow. Smart, professional, no wedding ring, wore his watch on the inside of his wrist. He nodded once as she sat down across from him with a cup of stale drip coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. "You're Jenkins," he said, not a question. Sarah didn't respond. He slid a napkin across the table, on it a scribbled series of numbers and a QR code. "Encrypted proton chain," he said. "We keep everything off-grid. No paper trail, no direct names. You'll be known as Atlas." She almost laughed. "Atlas, you're holding up the old world for us," he said without smiling. He was head of strategic operations at Innovate Dynamics. His code name was Nomad. That's all she learned that day. "That and one more thing, we don't want sabotage," he told her flatly. "Want victory? Clean, fast, targeted, no drama, no leaks. Give us what we need to build the better machine." Sarah nodded. "Then don't fumble what I give you." And so it began. Days became a blur of firewalls, pseudonyms, and drive-by data drops. Sarah set up 3 laptops, one air-gapped, one on a ghost OS booted from a flash drive, and one for her normal browsing to maintain the illusion of a life. Her old email account stayed active. LinkedIn remained untouched. She posted a smiling selfie of a post-corporate brunch with a fake caption about self-care. Nobody suspected a thing. Meanwhile, Atlas went to work. She dissected sterling price like a surgeon high on adrenaline. She sent Nomad playbooks on Arthur's behavioral patterns, how he responded to board pressure, his tells during investor calls, his addiction to short-term wins that made him allergic to long-term strategy, handed Innovate the full architecture of Sterling's marketing stack, pointed out the legacy vendors clinging to expired exclusivity clauses, exposed the bloated advertising contracts that inflated Sterling's quarterly numbers but delivered jack-all in returns. One night, she spent 4 straight hours recreating Sterling Price's org chart from memory, color-coding the weak links. The yes men, the insecure ladder climbers, the ones likely to flip when the pressure came. Her home turned into a war bunker, curtains drawn, whiteboards full of diagrams, red string pinned across printouts like a crime thriller cliché. She didn't sleep much, didn't need to. Her exhaustion had shapeshifted into something sharper. Controlled, chemical. Paranoia became her default mode. She met Nomad twice more in person, always at awful little diners with security cameras she could map blindfolded. Always timed precisely, never more than 10 minutes, never shook hands. At one meeting, she handed him a flash drive. "Arthur's next move," she said. "He's going to float a restructuring memo to bluff the board into extending his runway. It's trash, it's pure theater. Leak it strategically and frame it as internal desperation." Nomad scanned her face. "You sure? I wrote half of it 2 years ago. He just rebranded it and slapped on a new date. Trust me." But the stakes got real on a gray Friday afternoon. She was walking out of a nondescript coworking space where she'd met Nomad's assistant. She'd worn a nondescript parka, hood up, sunglasses on. The place had no signage, just a door buzzer. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she saw him. Troy, from BizDev, coming around the corner with a latte in one hand and his dumb Patagonia vest unzipped like he was trying to seduce the stock market. He didn't see her, not fully, but his head tilted. She felt it, a pause, that flicker of familiarity. Her heart went full jackhammer. She ducked back inside the building and walked straight to the janitor's stairwell, skipping the elevator. 3 flights down, out the service door into the alley. Breath sharp, sweat freezing down her back. She texted Nomad from the burner, possible visual exposure. May need to scrub site. No reply for 17 minutes. Then, logged. Recalibrating rendezvous points. Sat in her car afterward for nearly an hour, engine off, staring at the dashboard while the city moved around her like static. This was her life now, dangerous. Illicit, free. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, Senior VP of Marketing. She was Atlas, and she was learning to love the wait. It was after midnight on a Wednesday when Sarah found it. She was sitting cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by a chaotic jungle of files, old backups, forgotten archives, thumb drives in Ziploc bags labeled with black Sharpie from years she barely remembered surviving. Her laptop hummed beside her, screen cracked in one corner, running a batch of decryption scripts she hadn't touched since the rebrand in 2018. There was something manic in the air, like static before a storm. She hadn't slept in 30 hours, but her mind was blisteringly alert. The file wasn't even labeled anything important. It was buried inside a nested folder from an old team shared drive, innocuously titled Q4 Proj Alt Draft Final 2-1. XLSM, the kind of file everyone ignored because it looked like spreadsheet hell. She almost skipped it. Almost. It opened slowly, like it knew it was holding something toxic. At first glance, just budget lines. Vendor IDs. Line items and allocations, and dry as dust expense logs. Sarah had been staring at Sterling Price financials for years. She knew the scent of bullshit buried under formulas. This wasn't just some forgotten worksheet. It was a mask, a misdirection. There were references to a project that didn't exist in any Sterling roadmap she'd ever seen, Phase Infinity. That name had been tossed around once in a strategy offsite as a joke. A pipe dream Arthur had pitched in 2016. A tech-adjacent lifestyle brand aimed at Gen Z, complete with wearable bio-trackers and mood-synced fragrance diffusers. Pure ego fantasy. Everyone had laughed. She thought it died in the pitch room. But here it was, funded and bleeding, hidden inside vendor shells, reimbursed through layered subsidiaries with generic names like Icarus Holdings and Evo 9 Limited, names that looked legit until you noticed that every invoice came in at round numbers. No tax trail. No vendor contracts filed in procurement. Froze. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. Clicked deeper. Over $48 million had been funneled into Phase Infinity over the last 6 fiscal quarters, and every single dollar was buried under marketing R&D, experimental vendor partnerships, and consulting fees from companies that didn't exist outside P.O. boxes in Delaware and Nevada. It wasn't just incompetence. It was fraud. Straight-line embezzlement, camouflaged under layers of vanity, ego, and the assumption no one would ever look this deep. She stood up too fast, the room tilted. Arthur hadn't just made a bad bet, he'd built an entire mirror world of financial rot, and no one had noticed because the stock price stayed stable and the board kept sipping his Kool-Aid. But now she had it. The Rosetta Stone, the smoking gun, the silver bullet. Pick a metaphor, it didn't matter. She held in her hands the single piece of evidence that could rip Sterling Price's foundation out like a tumor. She didn't even sit back down. She paced, hands running through her hair, laughing, quiet at first, then louder, like something inside her had finally cracked and let the light in. Because this wasn't just leverage. This was checkmate. She booted her secure laptop, fired up the encrypted thread with Nomad. Atlas, you're going to want to sit down for this. Ending file packet. Phase inf arcback password. H0LYF1re49. She didn't wait for a response. She began building the dossier. Clean, neat, no fingerprints, just dates, figures, shell routing paths, and buried memos signed off by Arthur himself. She included the board presentations where the losses were suspiciously absent. The investor call scripts where Arthur flat out lied about unparalleled fiscal discipline. 20 minutes later, Nomad responded. Nomad, holy shit. Are you absolutely sure? Atlas cross-verified. This is his personal black hole. He's been cooking it for years. And if it leaks, Sterling Price stock will crater before the market closes. Another beat. Then, Nomad, this changes everything. This is the move. We go full acquisition protocol. Sarah leaned back in her chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in weeks. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. From adrenaline. From the knowledge that she had just rewritten the rules of the game in one sleepless night. She walked to the kitchen, cracked open a fresh bottle of wine, not the cheap stuff this time. Something decent, something aged. She poured a glass with a grin so wide it hurt. Arthur Sterling had stolen her future. Now she was going to take his entire legacy and sell it to his worst enemy, and he'd never even see it coming. Arthur Sterling never moved quickly. He prowled, he postured, pontificated, but panic had a way of speeding even the most arrogant bastards up. 3 days after Innovate Dynamics filed a seemingly prescient bid to outmaneuver Sterling Price on a government contract they'd held for 8 years, something in Arthur snapped. He stormed into the Monday exec sync 10 minutes early and shut the blinds, something Sarah had only seen him do twice in 15 years. Both times someone ended up escorted out by security before the coffee cooled. By that afternoon, an information containment task force had been quietly spun up. In other words, a witch hunt. Sarah learned about it from her last loyal contact, still buried inside Sterling Price, an assistant in legal who owed her more favors than she could count. She texted from a temporary number. Spinner, Arthur's breathing fire. thinks Innovate has a mole. You're going through digital logs and comms metadata, starting from the top down. Sarah's blood turned to stone. She checked her VPN traces, her message threads, her file transfers. Nothing tied to her directly. Her burner laptop never touched Wi-Fi. Her data dumps were disguised as dummy analytics traffic piggybacking on routine API pulls. Nomad had praised her OPSEC more than once. The terrifying thing about paranoia was that you didn't need to be caught to be destroyed. You just had to be suspected. And that's exactly what happened to Michelle Tran. Michelle had been in compliance. Smart, quiet, too principled for her own good. She and Sarah used to sneak off for coffee and share sarcastic notes about Arthur's manic jargon dumps. Sarah had even written her a glowing peer review once, called her the company's conscience. How Michelle was being hauled in for irregular activity on internal systems after someone traced a flagged query back to her terminal. It wasn't her. It was Sarah. Michelle had been running a standard quarterly audit report when the flagged packet pinged, a trace Sarah had accidentally routed through an old admin node Michelle once managed. A ghost path. A mistake. The next day, Michelle was gone. Walked out, purse clutched to her chest like a life raft, eyes wide with a quiet humiliation that pierced straight through Sarah like glass. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked confused. Why me? That look haunted Sarah into the next day and the one after that. It curled up in the pit of her gut like acid. She poured a stiff drink and stared at her whiteboard wall, once her war room, now looking more like a crime scene. Every red thread led back to her. She wasn't Atlas anymore. She was a scalpel with blood on the blade. Michelle had bled first. She messaged Nomad, Atlas, they fired someone. Innocent, my screw-up, we need to push heat away. Fast, Nomad, we have options, plant noise, leak false intel. Who do you want to burn? She stared at that last sentence for 10 full minutes. That's how this worked now, countermeasures. Shields made of corpses. She didn't want anyone else to pay. Not another Michelle. But if she didn't act fast, the entire operation would go up in smoke. The man who took everything from her would walk away clean, richer, cockier, untouchable. So she made the call. She logged into an old virtual machine she'd used once to manage data visualization training for new hires, one still connected to outdated account credentials. She doctored login timestamps, injected harmless but suspicious queries into archived SharePoint logs, spun up a mock email draft on behalf of a contractor who hadn't worked there since before COVID. Then she triggered a scan flag by remotely accessing the folder at 2:37 a.m., a time no one in their right mind would be working. It was crude, it was risky, but it was bait. 2 days later, Spinner messaged again. Spinner, IT dropped the Michelle angle. They're chasing some old training contractor now. Looks like a dead end. Arthur's placated for now. He's watching everything. Sarah shut her laptop and stared at her reflection in the window. The bags under her eyes looked permanent. Her hands were trembling, even without caffeine. She'd won the round, but it felt like losing something far deeper. This wasn't the surgical justice she dreamed about. This was messier, dirtier. The line between martyr and villain wasn't a line anymore, it was a fog. Michelle would never know what really happened, never know Sarah lit the fire that burned her life down. And maybe that was worse than being exposed. The silence, the guilt she couldn't unload. But still Sarah pressed on. Because the only thing worse than collateral damage was letting Arthur Sterling get away untouched. And if this was the price of his fall, regret, guilt, and a soul left a little darker, then so be it. The morning the news hit, it was like watching a bomb go off in slow motion. Innovate Dynamics launches hostile bid for Sterling Price Inc. The headline screamed across every financial site worth its ad revenue. Markets froze. Traders scrambled. Pundits flipped from condescending snark to breathless analysis within an hour. Sterling Price's board hadn't seen it coming, and that was the point. Sarah watched it all unfold from a dimly lit conference room inside Innovate's off-grid war suite, 2 floors above a derelict furniture outlet they used for cover. The walls were covered in laminated strategy trees. 3 screens buzzed in front of her, live feeds of cable news, stock tickers, and encrypted chats from embedded analysts and legal liaisons. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. Didn't need to. This was it, the final phase. Arthur's empire was under siege, and Sarah, no longer just Atlas, was at the heart of the assault. Omed handed her a new slate of talking points, but she was already ahead of him. Tell Patel to run with the outdated leadership angle, she muttered, not taking her eyes off the feed. Focus on Innovate's flexibility, their vision, their employee retention rates. Hammer the generational contrast. Already queued, Nomad said, tapping a secure tablet. What about the activist investors? Offer them a seat at the integration table. Don't threaten, entice. Make them feel like kings before the coup. A map of Sterling Price's largest shareholders glowed on the third screen, their influence weighted in brutal color-coded clarity. Sarah pointed at the top left quadrant, 3 firms whose portfolios tilted toward long-term stability over ego loyalty. Those 3 will tip first. They care more about returns than Arthur's golf retreats. Outside the room, Innovate's PR team worked like surgeons. Leaks had already been placed with 2 independent journalists. The phrase corporate rot had been whispered into the right inboxes. Anonymous insiders, handpicked and fed precise talking points, were calling attention to Sterling Price's internal instability, their dependence on archaic systems, their inability to evolve. And then came Arthur's counteroffensive. He held a live presser that afternoon, sweating, confident, fake laughing through his teeth like he was still in control. Called the bid reckless, said it would destabilize a cornerstone of American innovation, and mocked Innovate's size. Sarah muted the feed before he finished. Prepare the rebuttal deck, she said. Use his own quotes from the last merger. He said consolidation was the future. Let's hold him to that. She was moving now like a conductor on her Fifth Symphony, arms, eyes, thoughts in 3 places at once. Legal called, wanted to preemptively brief the FTC. She said yes, but spin it. Frame it as pro-competition. She told the digital team to deploy the pre-approved microsite, Sterling Tomorrow.com, a branded hub showcasing Innovate's visionary integration roadmap. Glossy, calming, ruthless. She wasn't just feeding Innovate intel anymore. She was writing the damn playbook. When Arthur moved, she moved faster. He sent out a rally the troops email to Sterling Price employees. Sarah intercepted a copy from Spinner within minutes. Forward it to our recruitment lead, she said. We start poaching now. Every frightened manager, every disillusioned VP, they get a personal call and a better offer. This isn't a siege, it's a rescue. By evening, Nomad leaned in. We've never had this much control, he said quietly. Not just of the data, the narrative, they're dancing to your music. Sarah didn't smile. She couldn't, not yet. It was running on fumes and vengeance, and a kind of white-hot focus that ate fear for fuel. Her hands ached. Her back was knotted, her throat dry. But her mind was lightening. She wasn't just surviving now, she was winning. Late that night, she stood alone on the building's rooftop, wind cutting past her like a silent scream. Cleveland's skyline blinked below, oblivious to the war unfolding behind polished press releases and controlled smiles. Somewhere across the city, Arthur was probably pacing in his penthouse, trying to spin failure into strategy. Maybe yelling at legal, maybe drinking, maybe planning a Hail Mary. She hoped so. She wanted him alive for the final blow, because now she was the one writing his ending, and she wasn't done yet. It all came down to a vote, not a lawsuit, not a backroom deal or a screaming match in a boardroom. Just a vote. 10:00 a.m. sharp. The shareholder meeting began under sterile digital lighting, half in person at Sterling Price headquarters, the rest logged in from glass towers across the globe, each click of the mouse worth more than Sarah's severance check. On the docket, whether or not to accept Innovate Dynamics' takeover bid. By 10:03 a.m., Arthur Sterling was already on CNBC, oozing confidence from behind his glass desk and billionaire smirk. This bid is noise, he said, smoothing his tie. Temporary turbulence. Shareholders are smart. They know who built this company. They know why it survived. Sarah muted him halfway through his victory lap. She'd heard that voice in 100 board meetings, the inflated vowels, the smarmy we that really meant me. He still believed he could bluff his way through this. Still believed charisma could drown a ledger. But charisma doesn't pay dividends. And this time, he was playing poker with his hand exposed. From her apartment, lights off, laptop open, phone silent, Sarah tracked every signal, every whisper. Spinner texted her coded updates from inside HQ. Nomad was embedded with the PR response team, ready to hit send on a full rebrand rollout the second the vote closed. An analyst at Goldman Sachs leaked early estimates, 54% leaning for the acquisition. Too close. Sarah's stomach clenched. At 10:41 a.m., institutional investor controlling a 4.7% block released a public letter. They had switched sides. Sterling Price's leadership has demonstrated a troubling lack of transparency, and strategic vision. We believe Innovate Dynamics represents a more agile, future-focused alternative. Arthur's expression, streaming silently on Bloomberg TV, twitched. Sarah sat frozen, fingers laced tightly around her coffee mug, watching the vote counter tick up on the investor portal feed. Tick, tick, each one a breath she didn't take. 10:57 a.m. A second swing voter flipped, 58%. 11:02 a.m. An emergency press release from Sterling Price, Arthur offering a last-minute restructure plan, all smoke and desperation. Too late. 11:10 a.m. The final count rolled in, 61.2% in favor. Shareholders had spoken. Sterling Price would be acquired. Arthur's empire, 15 years of smug press conferences, bloated initiatives, and performative loyalty was over. Sarah didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't cheer, she just sat very still. On her TV, Arthur blinked at the camera as the news broke. For a moment, he looked human, stunned, silent, like the bottom had dropped out of the world he thought he owned. His mouth opened, closed. The words didn't come. And then the feed cut. Phone vibrated. Nomad, it's done. We'll initiate transition protocol at 1400. You're in the room, Sarah. Title and compensation as discussed. Congratulations. She set the phone down and looked out her window at the dull gray Cleveland skyline. She'd won. But more than that, she'd ended something. Not just a company, not just a man. A lie. A whole ecosystem built on manipulation, arrogance, and the expectation that no one would ever fight back. Arthur had fired her and thought that was the end of the story. But Sarah had been the epilogue, the reckoning in heels. She leaned back on the couch, the tension finally bleeding out of her like venom lanced from a wound. Her apartment was quiet, still, just the soft hum of the fridge and the distant buzz of the city below. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt peace. It was raining, soft, steady, like the city had finally exhaled. Sarah stood in front of the Sterling Price building, the same steel-end glass monument to ego where she'd once trudged through 15 years of quiet loyalty and slow betrayal. Now it looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually, as if the soul had been sucked out of it the moment Arthur Sterling lost his crown. A new logo was already being welded above the revolving doors. Innovate Sterling Division. Sleeker font, leaner branding. They'd kept the name for the PR optics. Inside, everything had changed. Half the execs were gone. The corporate color palette had shifted. Even the security guards were different, professional, brisk, not a soul among them who remembered walking her out with that white HR box. She stepped inside. Her badge clicked green. It was official now. SVP of Strategic Integration, Innovate Dynamics. She hadn't just been given a new title. She'd been given power. Real power. A seat at the table. Say in who rises and who falls. And a stock package generous enough to make her old retirement plans look like monopoly money. The elevator hummed quietly as it carried her up to the executive floor. Her floor now. Outside the glass office at the end of the corridor, his old office, she paused. Arthur was inside, hunched over a half-packed cardboard box, pulling framed awards off the wall with mechanical detachment. On was the silver-tongued titan of CNBC interviews. No $6,000 suit, just a weathered blazer, hair thinning at the edges, a man reduced to packing peanuts and recycled bubble wrap. He looked up, froze. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. His lips parted like he wanted to say her name, but the sound never came. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. There was no need. Everything she'd ever wanted to say had already echoed through courtrooms, boardrooms, and newsrooms. Her silence was just the final punctuation mark. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, calm, steady, unshakable. Then she said it, slow and low, each word dipped in ice, "Get out of my office." Arthur blinked like he'd been slapped, then looked away quickly. He nodded once, tight, robotic, and grabbed the last of his things. The box under his arm was heavier than it looked, or maybe he was just smaller now. As he walked past her, didn't speak, didn't look back, and just like that, the king was gone. Sarah stepped inside. The office smelled like expensive wood polish and stale ambition. The desk had already been cleared. The walls were blank. Empty shelves waited like fresh canvas. She didn't sit down right away. She walked to the window instead, staring out at the gray Cleveland skyline. Same city, same buildings. But she was looking at it from a new altitude now, not as a survivor, as the architect. Behind her, a team waited. Transition reports, onboarding briefs, pending decisions. She had calls to take, divisions to shape, legacies to write. But just for a second, she let herself breathe it in. Not revenge, not justice. Victory. Cold, clean, absolute, and hers. Thanks for joining the fun, you office survivors. Subscribe for more switch-flicking drama. Let's make your former coworkers sweat.